Today we're going to take a look at the executive branch and particularly some of the jobs and duties of the executive branch, what the executive branch is, etc. So our goals are to explain the makeup, qualifications, and duties of the executive branch, to explain the factors impacting presidential approval rating, to describe the outcome of the Presidential Succession Act, to list and explain major accomplishments of presidents in the modern era, and to describe the executive branch at the state and local level. So we've gone over this diagram before. We've got the three branches of government. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch, Congress. Article 2 sets up the executive branch, the presidency. And Article 3 sets up the judicial branch. And so in our separation of powers, we're going to look at Article 2, the executive branch, today. I think it's worth pointing out that the executive branch is more than just the president. I think a lot of times we think just president, but the executive branch is actually made up of the entire bureaucracy of the federal government. So there are roughly between 1 and 3 million people that are part of the executive branch at the national level alone. Of course, the most famous is the president, but there are certainly other members of the bureaucracy that make up part of the executive branch, part of that branch that enforces the laws. So, of course, you know that the duties of the president is to enforce the laws, to carry out the laws. We've been through that over and over again. But again, it's not just the president. It also includes the president's cabinet and advisors. The cabinet members are some of the president's most influential and most important advisors. Of course, there are other advisors that fall within the White House that also help advise the president. We've got the bureaucracy, about somewhere between 1 to 3 million civil servants, non-elected people who work to carry out the day-to-day functions of the government. So, for example, if you work for the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, you're not an elected position. You've just got an everyday, ordinary job, but it's your job to enforce the laws, particularly the tax laws. And then finally, at the state and local level, we've got governors, mayors, township supervisors. They all count as part of the executive branch at the state and local level. But first, the president. So the office of president. According to Urban Dictionary, the president is a political figurehead that all of America blames their problems on, acting as if the president had any real power and was deliberately making horrible decisions. Before getting this job, no one will give a hoot about who you are. When you get this job, everyone in the country, whether conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, etc., will hate you at one point or another. After you leave this job, people will either praise you to high heaven or complain about how badly the country is doing because you were the president. Or definition number 3, a person who lies. And I think all of these sort of embrace what the presidency is, what the executive branch is. Personally, I think the president is in some ways the single most powerful person in the world. You might be able to make an argument for the Pope up there with the American president, but at the same time, the president doesn't always have as much power as you might think, and we'll get to that as we go through this unit. So the president could at the same time be the single most powerful person in the world, but yet maybe not have as much power as sometimes we think. A survey was done in the year 2000 by C-SPAN, and they ranked the 5 best presidents and the 5 worst presidents, and the worst of all time was James Buchanan, followed by Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, William Harding, and William Harrison. And of course, what do these two have in common other than that their last name starts with an H? Yes, they are from the great state of Ohio. It figures Ohio would produce 2 of the worst presidents of all time. Whether you agree with or disagree with this survey, what I want you to think about is some qualifications of how did the experts come to this conclusion? How did they get to the idea that Lincoln and Roosevelt and Washington were the best presidents and that Harding and Harrison and Buchanan were among the worst? And so thinking about the duties of the president, I want you to think about as we go through this unit, what makes a good president and what makes a bad president. So presidential approval rating is something that you'll notice a trend from every president in the modern era, and we generally consider the modern era to be sometime around the idea of Eisenhower, maybe even going back to FDR, we consider the modern era. But basically, presidential perception, as you've noticed from each and every one of these approval rating charts, usually starts out pretty high and then it gets pretty low. And this is what we call the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period means that when a president gets elected, everybody's got a lot of optimism for the future. Everybody's looking forward to the future. Everybody's going off of the president's promises from the campaign, and it looks like we're going to have great change in the world. And then, of course, as the presidency continues as time goes on, we realize the political realities, and that's that the president has to have the approval of Congress to do just about anything. The president can't act on his own. He doesn't have quite as much power as sometimes we would think, and as a result, presidential approval rating almost always goes down. The exception is Bill Clinton. His approval went up after he won the election, and part of this skyrocket was after he was found to be cheating on his wife. So I don't know what that says about Americans, that we would raise the approval rating of a president who cheated on his wife. But then again, the economy was doing well, so maybe that's what Americans were thinking about with that one. But pretty much other than that, every other president starts off pretty high, and then their approval rating goes down. The two or maybe three major factors that affect presidential perception, that affect the president's approval rating. Number one, the economy. When the economy is good, generally people like the president. If the economy is bad, people blame the president. Even though the president actually has very little to do with the economy. Maybe not little, but he doesn't have maybe as big of a role as we give him credit for. As you'll learn when you have economics class, it is really with the business cycle, the economy is going to go up, the economy is going to go down, regardless of what the president or Congress do. But still, we like to give the president a lot of credit when things go right. We like to give him a lot of blame when things go poorly. Much the same can be said during a time of war. Usually when we're at war, we tend to see a spike in presidential approval rating. The only exception is if the war drags on and on and on forever. So if we look at George W. Bush, his approval rating went up during the war, but as the war dragged on, it went down. We see the same thing with Nixon and Johnson with Vietnam. As the war continued on, approval rating eventually went down. And then sometimes just anytime there's a national tragedy, George W. Bush's approval rating went up after September 11th because people tend to look to the president as being that national figurehead. They tend to look at the president as being a source of national pride. So again, we can look at another chart, another set of surveys that shows roughly the same thing. As president's term goes on, usually approval rating goes down. All right, so how do you get to be president? Well, we know Article 2 of the Constitution sets out the requirements to be president, and they are fairly simple. You must be at least 35 years old, which way back in the day used to be considered pretty old. I'd like to think of that as being pretty young since I'm only 36, and I only recently got to the age where I could be president. I'm never going to get elected president. You also have to be a 14-year resident of the United States. That means that if you are living somewhere else, you have to have lived here 14 years continuously, and you must be a natural-born citizen. And so that may come into question in recent years. What defines a natural-born citizen? But you must have been born on American soil, or at least as the Constitution says, a natural-born citizen. Other than that, that's it. That's all you need to do to be president. A presidential term is, of course, how many years? Yes, you guessed it, 4 years. How many terms? Yep, 2 terms. And how many years? No, it's not 8, it's 10. So 4 years, 2 terms, that's 10. And if you're wondering how it becomes 10, a president could actually take over for, if the president was first the vice president and takes over for an incapacitated president, then he could, in theory, serve out 2 years of the other president's term and then serve 2 terms on his own. On the other hand, if it was 3 years of another president's term, then he couldn't run again. So you can have a total of up to 10 years in the presidency. I don't know why they picked that weird number, but it's what the Constitution says. And technically, this is something very recent. We know Franklin Delano Roosevelt served for 4 terms. Well, he died halfway through his 4th term in office. And after that, people decided that as good of a president as FDR was, of course, he made the top 5 list that we looked at before, even with him being president for that long of a time, people decided maybe it's a good idea if we have some type of change. There were literally people who were in their 20s and had never known another president other than FDR. So in 1951, Congress amended the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment, and that's where we came up with the 4 years per term, 2 terms, and a total of 10 years to be president. Now, if something happens to the president, well, he is president, or she, but thus far we've always had male presidents. Something happened to the president, or if the president resigns, like you can see Richard Nixon's resignation letter here, then we have to come up with the new president, who's going to take over. And of course, the most obvious is the vice president takes over. But then the problem that we had is, well, what if something happens to the vice president? Then what happens next? And that's when Congress came up with the Order of Secession, the Presidential Order of Secession. What happens if something happens to the president? So the Presidential Secession Act says that if something happens to the president, next in line is the vice president. That's as far as we've ever gotten in our history. After the vice president would be the Speaker of the House. After the Speaker of the House of Representatives, we would have the President pro tempore of the Senate. After the President pro tempore of the Senate, we would then go through the cabinet positions in the order that they were created. So this is what you'll need to know. You'll need to know that first it's Vice President, then Speaker of the House, then President pro tempore of the Senate. Then you'll just need to know the general 15 cabinet positions in the order that they were created. If you're curious as to what those are, Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, etc., all the way down to Homeland Security, the newest of the departments that was created by George W. Bush in order to protect us against terrorism. So if you want to find a way to remember this, we've got the Presidential Secession Act, the Presidential Secession Song.
If a satellite fell upon the head of the president, the VP would fill his shoes. And if the VP stroked and he croaked, then the Speaker of the House would pay his dues. And if he fell into a never-ending hole, never to be seen again, the President pro tempore of the Senate would become the president. This is the succession of the president, follow us down the line. This is the succession of the president, and everyone has their time. If the president pro tempore of the Senate flies in a bear attack, rawr, do not fret, not yet, Secretary of the State will have his back. If he spontaneously combusts into dust and in a gust, he is heaven sent. Then the Secretary of the Treasury becomes the president. This is the succession of the president, America's backup plan. This is the succession of the president, enjoy it while you can. If the Sec of the Treasury lost his head in the red of the 3 predator lights, then the Sec of Defense and Attorney Gen get killed by Cenobites. And the Secretary of Interior bowls above a Fed and falls into a Sarlacc pit. Then the Secretary of Agriculture will become the president. The Sec of Ag, he goes outside and gets bit by a zombie. Then he bites the acting Secretary of Commerce and he becomes a zombie. Secretary of Labor gets bit. Secretary of Health and Human Services gets bit. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development gets bit. Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy get bit. This is the succession of the president, it'll never get this bad. This is the succession of the president, cause that'd be really sad. Then Gozer appears, and the Secretary of Education, and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs cross the streams. And they both die because they don't know how to properly work proton packs, even though in the movies they said you couldn't cross the streams, but then they did and it worked, but these guys aren't real Ghostbusters, so they died. Everybody's dead, and no one is left, except the Secretary of Homeland Security. That was the succession of the president, now it's stuck in your head. That was the succession of the president, all but one are dead. But wait a minute, Joe.
Yeah, Steve?
What happens if that guy dies? Who becomes the president after that?
Well, let me tell you.
Okay.
See, the House could elect a new Speaker of the House, or the Senate could elect a new President pro tempore of the Senate. Whoever does it first, that person becomes the president. And if he dies, well, then they'll be taken over by another one. They can just keep electing President pro tempores and Speaker of the House people. And, you know, it's whoever does it first. It's this weird race to the top. It's not really set in stone. But then if they keep dying, they'll just keep electing new ones.
And there you have the Presidential Secession Act of 1947. In case you're curious as to when this has happened, it's actually happened more frequently than you might imagine. William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia. Zachary Taylor died of stomach disease or some type of digestive illness. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was assassinated. James Garfield was assassinated. William McKinley was assassinated. Warren Harding died of heart failure in office. FDR died of a stroke in office. Kennedy was assassinated, and Nixon resigned. So probably more assassinations than you would think as far as president goes. So that's the Secession Act. Now, as far as president goes, it's a fairly decent job. Presidential pay is pretty good. You make about $400,000 a year, which to me seems like a lot of money, considering that's like 6-7 times of what I make a year. Actually, probably even more than that. Probably more than 8 times of what I make a year. But that being said, if you are somebody who became the president, chances are your salary is actually probably pretty high before you even become president. And compared to what a CEO of a major corporation would make, 400 grand a year is nothing. You don't run to be president because of the money you make while you are president. You run to be president because you want to fulfill your ego and you want to make a difference in the world, and, well, because of your ego. If we look at the average pay of a CEO in America, it's about $5.4 million. President, similar skills, running the entire country, basically being CEO of a country, 400 grand a year. Compared to the average pay of a worker in Michigan of 40 grand, yeah, sure, that's a lot of money. But then, and of course, compared to minimum wage, what many of you make, yeah, that's pretty good pay, but it's still not a lot compared to what other people could make. Now, there are some other benefits to being president. You do get an expense account of 50 grand. That's a pretty generous expense account. That's almost my yearly salary. You get a travel account of 100 grand on top of when you travel for official business. And generally, presidents try to find a way to make almost everything official business. You get an entertainment account of $19,000 a year. You get a pension plan of $143,000 a year for the rest of your life. So 143 grand to sit around and do nothing once you retire after a 4 or 8 year job. That's not too bad of a deal. In addition, while you're president, you're pretty much not paying for anything. Most of your food is covered. You get to live in the White House, which compared to other executive mansions is not that big, but still compared to the house that many of you are living in, probably kind of big. Of course, we know that President Trump didn't really want to live in the White House too much because his other properties, it's kind of a downgrade compared to what he's got. But for most presidents, even at the presidential level, the White House would be a step up. The president also has access to a private resort area, Camp David. The president also has access to Air Force One, his own private airplane, which they say could get hit by a nuke in the sky and survive. I don't know that I know we've never tested it. Hopefully we'll never have to test it, but still pretty cool plane. If you go to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, you can actually check out Air Force One. They've got an old one on display there. The president also has his own private helicopter, Marine One, and of course, the Beast. He's got the presidential limousine and a chauffeur to take him around everywhere. They say one of the weirdest things about president when you get done with office is actually having to learn how to drive on your own again. All right, next what I'd like you to do is to describe what you think a typical president might look like. No, you don't need sentences, just a couple of keywords. All right, so a typical president, as you can see from this, all the former presidents of the United States, typical president generally is white, other than President Obama. Typically, the president has been white, male, European, also Christian, and pretty well educated. All of these men went to Ivy League schools. None of them are stupid by any stretch of the imagination. So just like Congress is much more well educated than the rest of the American population, so too is the president. If you want to check out what every president did before they were president and sort of some of their political experience, you can pause it and you can look at this chart. But for now, we will move on then. So when we look at the vice president, I think this quote from John Adams is probably the most appropriate way to describe the vice president. John Adams once said, "In this I am nothing, but I may be everything." And what he meant by this is there's not too many official duties of the vice president, but if something happens to the president, then he gets a whole lot of power and he becomes the president. So we can divide the duties of the vice president into unofficial duties and official duties. Unofficially, the vice president is the president waiting. He's basically waiting for something to happen to the president, and in most cases hoping that nothing actually does happen to the president, because that's a lot of work and a lot of stress if the vice president had to take over. More unofficially, in today's world, the vice president serves as a public figurehead, serves as a symbol of the government, and just like the president travels giving speeches and negotiating with foreign countries, a lot of times the vice president will do this as well. Although technically, according to the Constitution, the vice president doesn't have this power. It's one of those unofficial things that we've built over time. The only official duties of the vice president listed in the Constitution are, if you remembered from the last unit, the vice president serves as the president of the Senate, the presiding officer in the Senate, and if there is a tie in the Senate, the vice president gets to break the tie. That's it. That's the only thing that's actually listed in the Constitution as far as vice president goes. Once a president or vice president is actually elected to office, this is the oath of office that the president takes. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And most presidents have unofficially added, "So help me God" at the end, but that is not technically part of what is listed in the Constitution. There are executives at the state level. We've mentioned them before. We've talked about the executive branch being the president and the president's cabinet, and of course the bureaucracy. But at the state level, we've got a governor, and instead of a vice governor, we have a lieutenant governor. Other members of the executive branch at most state levels, an attorney general, a secretary of state, and a state treasurer. In addition to this, there are the bureaucracy members, people who work for the state police, the state tax department. There are many, many, many government employees that work for the state government that serve to execute the laws at the state level. And then at the local level, we've got executives. Depending on the type of government you have, cities usually have mayors, townships have supervisors. So if you live in the city of Plymouth, you have a mayor. If you live in the township of Plymouth, you have a supervisor. And if you live in Canton Township, of course, you've got a supervisor. So currently, as of when we're recording this, the supervisor of Canton Township is a guy named Phil LaJoy. The supervisor of Plymouth Township is a guy named Richard Reaume. And the mayor of the city of Plymouth is Dan Dwyer. Just so you're familiar with those names in local politics, and of course this could change. But at the local level, it is usually a mayor and a township supervisor, as well as the township council that execute the duties and the jobs at the local level. So basically things that mayors do, they recommend or veto city laws, they preside over city council meetings, they hire and fire city employees, and they rate the budget. So just a little bit about what a mayor does. Well, that's all that we have for the executive branch today. I hope you have a wonderful evening and take care.